Raven's Cove was a town that few had ever heard of before the disappearances began. Nestled on the jagged coast, its cliffs rising sharply from the ocean, it had always been a place of stark beauty. The waves here could turn violent without warning, and the winds would whip through the narrow streets and steep trails with little mercy. Locals often spoke of the sea with reverence, acknowledging both its bounty and its danger. But no one could have predicted that over the next 3 decades, the town would become synonymous with mystery and loss. The first disappearance occurred in the spring of 1993. Jacob Harlow, a 42-year-old fisherman who had lived in Raven's Cove his entire life, vanished near the old lighthouse. Jacob was meticulous about his work and his routines, and he was known for his calm demeanor and cautious approach to the sea. On that morning, he set out alone to check the nets along the cliffs. His boat was later found tied securely at the dock, and his fishing gear was discovered neatly stacked on the rocks near the lighthouse. Authorities concluded he had fallen into the water during the storm that had rolled in overnight, but those who knew him best were unconvinced. The sea that day had been treacherous, yet Jacob had spent his life navigating it safely. Some townsfolk whispered that they had seen him arguing with a stranger on the cliffs the week before, but no one could confirm it. His wife spoke quietly about a lingering sense of unease he had felt in the days before he disappeared, a sense she could not explain. Years passed before another incident, but when it came, it left the town shaken to its core. In 2001, 17-year-old Sarah Lowry went missing while hiking one of the more popular trails outside town. Sarah was a bright student with plans for college and a job she loved at the local bookstore. She had set out in the late afternoon to explore the cliffs, taking a trail she had walked many times before. She was never seen again. Her backpack was found torn open at the edge of the trail, scattered with journal pages she had been writing in, and footprints led toward the cliffs before abruptly stopping. Search teams scoured the area for weeks but found nothing more. Police closed the case quickly, suggesting she had run off or suffered an accident, but her parents refused to accept this. To them, Sarah was careful, responsible, and cautious. She would not have walked into danger on her own. In 2010, a visitor to Raven's Cove became the next victim. Martin Blake, a 26-year-old tourist from the United Kingdom, had spent the day exploring the town and its rugged coastline. That evening, he went to the local pub with a friend and was last seen leaving around midnight, captured on a small camcorder walking toward the coastal path that led to the cliffs. The footage cuts off abruptly, and he was never seen again. His shoes were later found half a mile inland, as if he had turned away from the coast entirely. Investigators attributed his disappearance to the treacherous terrain and alcohol, but the details did not align. There was no evidence of a fall or struggle, and the odd placement of his shoes suggested something more than a simple accident. In 2017, the disappearance of Ellen Rowe brought the town into a state of quiet fear. Ellen was a 68-year-old widow who spent her mornings birdwatching along the cliffs and wooded areas surrounding Raven's Cove. One morning, she did not return from her usual walk. Her car was found parked at the trailhead, and a set of footprints led into the tall grasses before stopping suddenly. Search dogs were unable to follow the scent, and their handlers reported an eerie experience. The trail ended abruptly, as though Ellen had vanished into thin air. Residents began to whisper about a figure dressed in black that some hikers had spotted near the cliffs that day, a presence that seemed to move deliberately and watch the trails. The most recent incident occurred in 2024, striking the town with profound shock. Daniel Whitmore and Emma Clark, a young engaged couple, went hiking at dawn along the cliffs. Hours later, neither returned home. Their phones were still active for a time, pinging towers at separate locations miles apart. Witnesses claimed to have heard distant calls for help coming from the cliffs, yet search parties found no evidence of the couple. Not a footprint, not a discarded item, nothing that could explain their sudden disappearance. Their families arrived from nearby cities, desperate for answers, but like the others, they left with none. Over time, patterns emerged that suggested these were not isolated tragedies. All the disappearances had occurred within a 15-mile stretch of Raven's Cove. None of the victims were ever recovered, and every official explanation pointed to accidents or misadventures. But the town itself began to fracture under the weight of suspicion. Some residents insisted the cliffs and treacherous terrain were to blame, that human error and nature combined to create these tragedies. Others feared a darker reality, suggesting a predator who understood the landscape intimately and exploited its dangers. Still, others whispered about the town officials, implying a deliberate suppression of information to protect tourism and avoid panic. In interviews conducted over the years, conflicting narratives emerged. One longtime resident spoke of the cliffs and the sea as relentless forces that claimed lives, saying, "It's a dangerous place. You respect it or it takes you." Another countered, 7 disappearances in 30 years is not coincidence. There is something more here, and no one wants to talk about it. Former search and rescue volunteers spoke of being pressured to end searches early, instructed that enough had been done to satisfy appearances. Families, meanwhile, clung to hope. Jacob Harlow's wife left his fishing gear untouched in the shed, a silent tribute to the husband she refused to lose. Sarah Lowry's room remained frozen in time, her journal and books still neatly arranged as if she might return. Martin Blake's parents visited from overseas, bringing flowers to the cliff paths where he was last seen. Ellen Rowe's neighbors placed small tokens at the trailhead, and Daniel and Emma's families made annual pilgrimages to the cliffs, still hoping for answers that never came. The history of Raven's Cove itself seemed to conspire with these disappearances. The town had grown around the cliffs and the ocean, its architecture clinging precariously to the slopes, its streets narrow and winding. The cliffs were riddled with hidden paths, sudden drops, and caves that opened unpredictably into the sea. Storms could cut off access to areas in minutes, and fog often rolled in with little warning, obscuring the landscape completely. The town's small population created an insular community, one where secrets could be kept, stories altered, and events forgotten or misremembered. Every missing person became part of a growing mythos, their stories blending with local lore and everyday cautionary tales. Theories circulated endlessly, debated over kitchen tables and in quiet bars. One theory suggested that the terrain itself was the culprit: steep cliffs, hidden drop-offs, treacherous waves. Another hinted at human involvement, a shadow moving unseen among the cliffs, preying on the unsuspecting. Some suggested that the town officials, fearful of the economic impact, were suppressing or mishandling information, ensuring that cases were closed quickly, that disappearances were minimized in the public record. The lack of evidence fueled speculation. If all the victims had truly been lost to accidents, why were there no bodies? Why did footprints sometimes vanish mid-trail? Why did personal items appear in places inconsistent with the supposed accidents? Community reactions were equally varied. Local families were divided between grief, fear, and suspicion. Longtime residents clung to practical explanations, citing weather, unstable cliffs, and occasional recklessness. Newcomers, visitors, and tourists spoke of unease, of the stories they heard whispered at inns and cafes. Some avoided the trails altogether, while others ventured with cameras and recording equipment, hoping to capture something unusual, anything that might provide a clue. Investigations unfolded in layers. Police reports provided a sparse official record, detailing missing persons, search efforts, and procedural closures. Journalists and amateur investigators dug deeper, uncovering inconsistencies and pointing to patterns across decades. Diaries, letters, and interviews were pieced together to form timelines, but the gaps between incidents grew frustratingly large. Each disappearance had its own nuances, yet commonalities persisted. The location within a tight coastal radius, the abrupt endings of trails or paths, the absence of bodies, and the questions left unanswered by those responsible for investigation. Despite decades passing, the town of Raven's Cove remained outwardly unchanged. Tourists still arrived in the summer months, drawn by the beauty of the cliffs, the sea, and the quaint streets. Locals continued with their routines, fishing, hiking, running small businesses, all while the weight of the unexplained lingered in the background. The disappearances were never far from conversation. their stories woven into the fabric of community memory, retold with subtle caution, a reminder of the fragility of life in a place that offered both beauty and danger in equal measure. Decades later, Raven's Cove continues to keep its secrets. The cliffs erode with each passing year, the waves reclaiming small sections of the coastline. Trees grow where paths once existed, erasing traces of footsteps. And yet, for those who pay attention, the absence of the missing is felt as acutely as the wind that blows off the sea. Were these disappearances tragic accidents, coincidences in an unforgiving landscape? Or was there a pattern, deliberate and dark, hidden in plain sight? The answers remain out of reach, leaving the town and its people with nothing but questions, speculation, and the silent presence of those who vanished. Until evidence emerges, Raven's Cove will remain a mystery, a town of striking beauty overshadowed by loss, a coastal enigma where the waves crash endlessly and the missing leave no trace.